Hello lovelies, it's me, Bitter Corella. Welcome to another episode of the show where we talk about dark tomes by dark writers. This is a very special episode because tonight my wife did my makeup. So I actually look pretty tonight. Please feel free to mention that in the comments. But now it's time to do that bit that I always do, where I ask the orb, what dark tome writer are we going to be discussing tonight? The orb will tell us. Well, it appears that tonight we will be discussing Thomas Ligotti. Thomas Ligotti, he's a little bit less well known than some other horror writers, and that's mainly because, unlike most horror writers, he's not really a novelist. He works primarily in short stories. And that works just great for him. A short story is the perfect venue for Ligotti to explore almost creepypasta type horror without the shackles of plot and character that you would expect in a longer form horror piece. His stories are very often just a cook's tour of a world very much like ours, but just a little bit off. His prose is dense and difficult, and very often you might arrive at the end of a Ligotti story without really understanding what happened, and yet still with a nagging sense that you've just read something that you really shouldn't have. While the fundamentally hopeful outlook of Kuntz and King is what makes their work really resonate with the non-horror audience, Ligotti is the exact opposite. He's got a dark and pessimistic worldview. In Ligotti's work, to be born is to be born into a world of pain and suffering and just pointlessness. Throughout his work, there is a subtle but distinctive longing for the blissful unconsciousness of the grave. His extreme pessimism does make him somewhat harder sell than other genre writers, which is unfortunate because Ligotti is probably one of the most striking voices in modern horror. Ligotti is probably the most Lovecraftian of modern horror writers, although he rarely reaches for the low-hanging fruit that title implies. You don't see a lot of tentacles in Ligotti's work, and very few references to Lovecraftian deities. When they do appear, it's very obliquely, like in The Sect of the Idiot. But there is always the sense that the universe is inherently hostile to humans, and that there are dark forces operating just outside the scope of human vision. The Ligotti story always leaves you feeling slightly off balance, like you're a confused tourist wandering through the streets of some foreign city. The stories are usually ostensibly set in our world in modern times, but they're always a little bit off, a little bit strange, so you never feel like you're completely at home. For example, even if it might be set in the United States, there'll be strange references to areas or provinces rather than states. And cities will have names that don't make any sense, that aren't inherently wrong, but just don't seem to flow from any known etymology. Cities like Miracaw or Knollgate. In terms of description, Ligotti is really the inverse Lovecraft. Whereas Lovecraft reveled in failing to describe things or simply saying things were too weird to be described, Ligotti will describe things in intricate, minute detail. In fact, he gets so ridiculously detailed that even everyday, ordinary objects start to take on a sinister pall and feel oddly otherworldly after his descriptions. Ligotti is a writer who brings Lovecraftian alienation closer to home. Whereas Lovecraft seemed to write about how the world as we know it is an isolated spot of light and sanity in an otherwise hostile, swirling cosmic void, Ligotti seems to think that even the world that we see is fundamentally alien and unknowable. Let's look at some common features of the Ligotti story. Number 1, sinister architecture. Just like Lovecraft, Ligotti writes stories about cities that are imbued with a deep sense of wrongness. In stories like Vestarian or The Greater Festival of Masks, you'll find cities that are impossibly huge, sprawling in all directions, too vast to map, and yet the streets are cluttered and claustrophobic, houses are cramped in, way too close. One of the interesting differences, though, is that whereas Lovecraft described impossible architecture, for example, angles that don't match up, Ligotti describes architecture that is plausible, but just insane. So you'll find doors placed in walls way too high to reach, staircases that go nowhere, alcoves just randomly in the sides of homes, and streets lined with houses that lean so far forward that they almost touch above the street, forming weird claustrophobic tunnels. A friend once described it in a way that I think makes a lot of sense. If you think of Lovecraft writing as being like an M.C. Escher painting, and Ligotti's writing as being a little more like the Winchester Mystery House. Number 2, dreams. There are a lot of dream sequences in Ligotti's work. And in Ligotti stories, a dream is usually some sort of portent. It's a glimpse beyond the veil into a reality far beyond our own. And this reality that we see beyond is terrifying precisely because it is so much more real than the reality that we know in waking life. But ironically, staying awake is not a haven from these dreams. In stories like The Music of the Moon or the Journal of J.P. Drupeau, we find protagonists who are driven by insomnia to wander the streets of the city at night, but the visions that they see in waking life at night are just as terrifying as those experienced in dreams, which really just plays into Ligotti's general theme that even the world as we know it, even the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave, are just as bizarre and hostile to us as the reality that lies outside the cave. Number 3, uncanny doppelgangers. Ligotti stories are filled with puppets, mannequins, dummies. Well, these dummies and puppets in Ligotti's work are rarely animated. This isn't really sort of a cheesy child's play or puppet master type situation where you can be expected to be killed by a puppet. Instead, the reason that they're frightening is because they are uncanny in the Freudian sense. They're not mysterious or strange, they're just so familiar, but just a little bit off, that they are they look almost human, but they're very obviously artificial. And it's that artificiality that makes them so disconcerting. They serve as a constant taunting reminder of that unconsciousness that they have achieved, and which Ligotti protagonists so woefully strive for. 4, clowns and masks. Similar to puppets, these are another aspect of the uncanny that appear throughout Ligotti's work. Although, unlike puppets, clowns and masked revelers are often more overtly malignant in Ligotti's work. Since they are alive, they can do harm. The clown, of course, is a frightening figure because his face is covered. He knows your identity, you don't know his, and his mask is licensed for him to disobey the normal, orderly rules of society. So he is dangerous and unpredictable. There is no telling what's hidden beneath the mask. Oh. Clowns and masks are things that hide the truth behind a fiction, and that's something you see again and again when clowns are invoked in Ligotti's writing. In The Last Feast of Harlequin, for example, the protagonist travels to a town where he's hoping to watch some festival of clowns. But the truth of the festival is actually much more sinister. Hidden within the revelry, there is a second, smaller festival, something that is much more ominous. A ritual, in fact. Number 5. Number 5, hypnosis and illusion. Hypnosis appears in Ligotti's work as the inverse of dreams. They're not there to reveal the truth, but rather to hide it. Hypnosis is something that allows us to close our eyes to the horrifying reality beyond the veil, and instead live in comfortable illusion. Number 6. This one's a little idiosyncratic. It might just be me, but I'm going to say it anyway. Thos. Thos is a name that occurs several times throughout Ligotti's writing, and to the extent that it feels like it has some meaning to the author. And it well might. I couldn't tell you what that is. But I'd venture to say it's just a really good example of Ligotti using names to unsettle. There's nothing inherently wrong with the name Thos. It's used several times as a surname in Ligotti's works. But it's one of those things where it's kind of odd. It rolls off the tongue easily, but it's hard to imagine anyone whose last name is actually Thos. When you think about it, it's like, what kind of name would Thos be? Who would be named Thos? It's the sort of thing that Ligotti excels in. Strange words and turns of phrase that feel like they should be meaningful. And their apparent lack of meaning makes you feel, again, unsettled. Things that draw your attention should have a purpose, but instead, very often they're just there for the sake of weirdness. Ligotti is probably one of the most inaccessible horror writers, not only because the things that he writes about are so strange, but his language is so impenetrable. His prose, like I mentioned, is really dense, and he tends to use really archaic language. That means that you'll never see Ligotti in the airport bookstore alongside Kuntz and King. He's not really light summer reading, so reading him is not always the most fun experience, but if you're looking for existential dread that really sticks with you, it's really worth the effort because there's no horror writer that's quite as rewarding as Thomas Ligotti. I hope you've enjoyed our little look at Thomas Ligotti. If you have, and you're watching this on YouTube, why not like and or subscribe? Or possibly both. Oh wait, that's implied by the and or. If you're seeing this on public access TV, of course, you can do neither of those things, but you can check us out on our Twitter account. it's midnight_pals. We'll talk much more about Ligotti there, as well as plenty of other horror writers. Well, we'll see you next time, and until then, enjoy your mortal coils.
Ghostbusters.